Most people assume that solid wood is always the better choice, but that's just not true. In reality, some of the most expensive furniture in the world is veneered, and one of the best examples of this is the Chippendale furniture at Dumfries House. The famous Chippendale bookcase there is a perfect example of why veneer should not be dismissed. On paper, it was valued around £2 to £4 million, but in a heated auction environment, a figure of 20 million was not considered unrealistic. Now that's because this kind of furniture isn't valuable simply because it's made of wood or veneer. It's valuable because it's a one-off by a master craftsman with rarity and provenance and design all working together. Once you see a master craftsman using veneer at the very highest level, it becomes hard to argue that veneer is a villain. Veneer is just simply a material choice, not a sign of poor quality. The real question is, how is the furniture made, what is it made of, and whether you, the buyer, understand what you're getting. Now, buying the wrong piece of furniture for your lifestyle is where most people go wrong, and solid versus veneer is no different. Now, the first thing to cover today is the myth that veneer equals fake. Now, it's true that a veneer can be a bit of laminate, a bit of plastic, any sort of man-made material that is glued onto the top of something. However, in the discussion today, we're going to talk about real wood veneer. And normally that is what is used on furniture. Now, as I said, real wood veneer is just normally really thinly sliced from a piece of real wood. Now, at this moment in time, this piece in front of you here can be described as solid wood. It's just a really thin piece of solid wood. Now, as I said, again, veneer is normally really thin, under a millimetre. This one here is 0.7, although there's a bit of glue there, 0.6. So these sheets that I bought were 0.6 millimetre in thickness, and that's what they are. However, it is not like a bit of plastic that you will just be able to manipulate and bend. This will still have the fibres in it, but it will break after a certain period of manipulation. As you can see there, the fibres are still there in the wood because it is, at this stage, still solid timber, just really thin. Now, a lot of mid-century furniture designers, like the famous Eames chair or any sort of Danish pieces, rely on veneer. Now, they do that mainly for stability and overall design. Now, veneer exists because it solves a real design and engineer problem, not because it is a poor substitute for solid wood. Some of the most striking furniture designs depend on a veneer, especially when makers want a complex grain pattern, such as book matching or a starburst effect, or when they want a large, continuous piece to look like one bit of timber. Now, you can use solid wood for that. However, because the timber naturally moves and expands and contracts with changes in temperature and humidity, the solid wood would force this design to start splitting, warping, or pulling itself apart over time. That is why a veneer should not be seen as a cheap alternative, but an intentional choice that does allow for both design precision and long-term stability in the product. Now, one important question to ask is, what is the substrate of the furniture piece that you're looking at? If it is a veneer, what is used underneath that veneer can sometimes be a more important question to ask than what the top of the product is, whether that's solid wood or veneer. Now, these are two example boards here. This they call sometimes pippy oak, or they sometimes call it figured oak, and this is just a standard piece of oak veneer here with this pattern here is something that they call a cathedral. Now, this has just been attached on a piece of MDF, 18mm thickness, and this piece here has just been tacked onto a thin piece of plywood. Now, depending on the thickness that is used in the piece of furniture will depend on the application of the product and the cost involved overall. Now, MDF and particle board, as I say, they're stable and consistent, which is why they're widely used, but they don't cope well with moisture. Now, if moisture was to get into any of these products that have MDF on them, what you tend to find is that the MDF will swell and it'll start popping the wood. So you'll have like this blister on top of the wood. By contrast, plywood is a stronger, more premium option and is more resilient to water ingress. However, it is not 100% water resistant, but it does hold up better under stress. Now, when looking at solid wood, we have to remove the romance from reality. Now, this piece in front of here on the left hand side is a solid piece of oak. This is one piece and this is another piece. Now, these two pieces are glued together and that is still legally classed as being 100% solid. As long as the materials are the same and both materials are solid, then you can legally say that that is 100% solid oak. Now, the problem with solid oak is that it's a living, breathing material that consistently moves, it warps, it flexes. So if we go back to this piece of veneer here, sometimes the product will bow like that, sometimes it'll warp. So from corner there to front corner there, it'll sometimes warp like that. It'll sometimes split up grains. So essentially, it is still a living product that will move when you have the central heating on or the underfloor system. Now, the upside of it is that it is much more easier to repair and structurally it is more sound than what a veneer is. It will hold spillage of water better than an MDF. Again, it will not be 100% unsusceptible to water. You will still get bits of raised grain in it. However, you can sand those back and you can fix those more easily than what a veneer would be. Now, there is a maintenance tax with some oak furniture, especially that being oiled. This product in here in front of you is oiled. It has just darkened over the years. If we were to sand it back, it would come back to more this colour here. However, it's had an oil on it, and where it's been stored, it's just darkened down over the years. Now, oak, when it is oiled, or really any oiled piece of furniture, is more susceptible to that movement that we talked about, the warping, the cupping, the splitting. When it is open like that, so it still is essentially the wood, it's just got a light oil coating to stop it drying out, it is more susceptible to those moisture changes versus that of a polyurethane or a lacquer finish. So that is something to bear in mind with oil furniture. The other downside, depending on how you look at it, is extremely heavy and it's not always practical for modern homes. Now, if you were to move a table about or host people and you wanted to move this to the side of that, sometimes a solid piece of wood furniture is extremely heavy and it does not like to be moved about. The more you move it, the more susceptible it is to having problems. Now, if we go back to just have a quick look at the veneer again, this is a far more stable product in terms of that splitting and that cracking and that warping. It is tend to be lower maintenance. Once a veneer is put on a product, it tends to be a polyurethane or a lacquer that's put on top of it, which generally means that you just have to give it a bit of a polish up with a furniture grade wax. Don't be using the silicone spray ones. They can sometimes start to cause a clouding underneath the lacquer or the polyurethane that's on it. Now, these are much more friendly for moving about. Again, with furniture, especially tables, you don't want to be dragging them, you want to be lifting them properly, but they are more better if that you have a smaller sized house, that you can move these pieces about more if you want to utilise your home for something more than just stationary furniture in that place. Now, something we covered just briefly with when we talked about the solid timber is if you got a bit of water ingress on this, what would generally happen is the fibres would lift up. And what you can do if you're lucky is you can just put a bit of glue underneath and clamp it down, a light sand and reapply some oil. You might have to apply a bit of stain, but generally speaking, you can get it back to looking near enough how it was. Now, unfortunately, you cannot do that with the MDF. If you were to start sanding this back, what would happen is you would go back to the MDF substrate relatively quickly. If it will focus, you can see here that there is only that 6mm thick piece of timber before you hit the MDF substrate. So again, maintenance wise or repairability wise, solid is better than the MDF. The MDF will repair to a certain degree. You can repair it with pens and waxes. I might do that in a future video. But repairability, the solid always wins. But for structural reasons, the MDF wins. So you have to think about, if you were having a household with a lot of children in it, that you were maybe using the table for, let's say, homework at the end of the day, or colouring in or whatever, this solid oak would more than likely be a better option for you. Now, that's not to say that if you can't afford the solid alternative, that the veneer is going to be a bad product for you. It's just that this, if it got any ink or bleed through from any sort of paper on it, you could sand it back, you could re-oil it, and it would be relatively as good as new. The veneer, as previously discussed, you cannot do that with that. Now, you can just put down table covers or mats, etc., like you would if you were having a hot plate or a cup of tea. So again, that's not for me a deal breaker. And this is what we're talking about at the beginning, with essentially which one is right for your lifestyle. There is no perfect piece of timber. As I say, this is 100% solid, more expensive. If it's oiled, it's more prone to cupping, splitting. Whereas this, it is a veneer product, it is cheaper made, it is lighter, and it is more stable. However, if it was to get damaged, then you have to really be careful or really know what you're doing to fix it, and sometimes the repairs aren't worth the cost. I've realised a lot in this video that I've tapped, which may actually bring me on to the next segment, which is, how do you tell the difference between a solid and a veneer? So with a solid piece of timber, what will often be said to you is the weight. Now, me holding this piece of timber here, it is roughly on par. The veneer piece is slightly bigger, but the weight of this is more substantial to the weight of this MDF. Now, that doesn't always hold true though. What most people do is they'll lift up the end of a table to check the weight, and they'll say, oh, that's solid. Now, a large piece of MDF, 18mm thick, 1.8 metres by 900 wide table, will still feel heavy to the average person. It is not a definitive measurement of solid versus veneer being the weight. The other thing that you'll sometimes often be told in a shop is that if you can follow the grain pattern round, finger piece up here, if you can follow the grain pattern round the edge, that proves it's solid. However, that is again not always the case. If we have a look at this piece of veneer, you can, if it will stand still for me, you can follow the grain all the way around. Because this piece of veneer is off this sheet, it was cut and it was added on the side. Yes, if you look closely, you can maybe see a bit of dark banding along the edge. However, in the light of a showroom, you're in the heat of a buying decision. Are you going to notice that? No. So, or you might do, but most people won't. So this is not a definitive check again for a veneer versus a solid. Now, most of the time you will not, on a veneer, get it like this. It's more expensive to do this with a veneer. What you'll generally find is the grain will go like this, and then the grain will go that way. that is an easy tell for if something is veneered, if the grain suddenly changes or goes in opposite direction. But again, it is not always a tried and tested method of is something veneered, is something solid. Now the other one is the famous advert from the oak place retailer, and it's knock, knock. If I lift it up to the microphone, this is the MDF, and if I lift this piece up, that's the oak. Now again, would you be able to tell the difference in the store? I don't know if you would. So what you're then relying on is lots of different little signals that would tell you if something is solid or not. So if a table is running top to bottom and it has a continuous timber and it doesn't have a sort of edging piece like you would have this piece would go along here, this bit butts up to this is more likely a veneer. If there's a one piece of timber going one way and one the other way, it's more likely a veneer. Now that again is not always 100% true, because sometimes this is done for a design. Now, if the table is straight planked, so it's the same timber all the way from top to bottom, left to right, again, it's normally indicative of a solid piece of timber, but it is not always the case. So you have to start just looking about at the product, looking about it underneath it, and making a best case assessment for, is this veneered or is this not? Now, if I go back to the thinner piece of plywood that we looked at before, sometimes what you'll find, maybe not necessarily this thin, but you'll have a thick oak edge. In fact, I'll do it the other way. But if you were looking underneath the table, what would normally happen is the edge, there would be a step down, there would be a gap, because this piece is thinner than this piece. Again, that is normally indicative of a veneer, but not always 100% of the time. It could be that they've used a thinner piece of material to not have it as thick, but then again, you wouldn't really want to do that, because this thinner piece of solid wood, if that was what it was, would be more prone to cupping, splitting and warping depending on how it was manufactured and made. So you are at the mercy somewhat of the retailer and what they tell you about the product. You can check things if it's a sideboard, things like a drawers. Underneath the drawer, they normally tend to use a sort of cheaper veneer, or sometimes they use a native timber to the country which it was produced in, normally China or some sort of Asian manufacturing house. So check the drawers, check the back, give it the tap, check the weight, but again, there is no definitive answer of this is 100% solid or not. It does take a few years of keen eye to notice if something's solid or not. So don't get too discouraged, but at least hopefully you will now understand more about what products is better for you and not be so concerned if a piece was veneered. Now, one last topic to cover would be sustainability. Generally speaking, a veneer will be more sustainable than what a solid piece of timber will be. Now, you may argue against that, which is absolutely fine, but a veneer uses slightly less, or uses a lot less timber than what a solid piece of, in this case, oak would. Now, you could argue that this wood here has come off of, or this MDF here has become off the production of a vast amount of cutting of solid timber. And yes, that is correct. But essentially this is a waste product. So you've got a waste product that would otherwise be used for something else or thrown out on top of a thin slice of wood. This here, you need more of the tree. There is not always, depending on the grade of the timber of the wood, enough in one tree to build that piece of furniture. If you want something that is quite like this piece here, not a lot of knots to it, you're looking at more the central part of the tree. So essentially this is going to be more expensive. It's going to use more timber to get that perfect looking piece of furniture. Now, the thing we have to talk about in the MDF is the formaldehyde glues. Now, a lot of places are moving away from it. A lot of places already have. However, you do need to still consider that when you're looking at an MDF product, maybe a cheaper made laminate. Formaldehyde glue is not a great glue at all. It's very toxic. It's not environmentally friendly at all. Breaking down in the environment, it does not do that very well at all. Normal wood glue is normally a PVA glue that is used. It's normally a water-based glue. So if you are looking for a more environmentally friendly furniture buying, if you were buying brand new, go for veneer. Even better if you buy second hand. However, again, you just got to watch for those scratches, gouges, etc. in the piece of veneer that you're maybe buying second hand, because they're not easily fixed. But just in closing, there is no best solid versus veneer. Those who tell you solid will be because they have a lot of solid and they want to sell that more. Those who tell you solid's not good, maybe more the veneer. Somebody who's objective and tells you both sides of the story, that is more in line with someone that you can trust with your furniture purchase. Now, just a quick recap. Solid is better for repairability. However, it's generally more expensive. It uses up more timber to create the product, and it is prone, especially if it's an oil like this one is, to warping, splitting and cracking. MDF is cheaper. However, it is just a thin substrate that is on the material. It cannot be easily sanded back, or it can only lightly be sanded back. If it gets a big gouge or a chip in it, you would have to use filler pens, a bit of filler, and try and stain match it. Which one's better for you? Unfortunately, that's only a decision that you can make. However, do not be led that this is better because it's 100% solid. It is only better if it fits your environment and is what you want. MDF, veneer, plywood veneer is still a decent product. You will pay less money for it, so there is always a trade-off here. You just have to decide what's good for you and what's good for your family at the end of the day.